The first sound inside the grand chamber of the cradle was silence. Not the ordinary kind, where people simply stop talking. This was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and old. The kind that only comes when thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds hold their breath at the same time. The chamber was enormous. It had been carved into the heart of a moon-sized space station over a period of 300 years. The ceiling was so high that light took a noticeable moment to reach it. Every seat was filled. Delegates in formal robes, generals in decorated armor, ambassadors wrapped in the colors of their homeworlds. All of them arranged in perfect tiers, the most powerful at the front, the least significant at the back. In the very last row, almost pressed against the rear wall, sat a human named Roan Aldrich. He was 34 years old, of average height, with the kind of face that people forget 10 minutes after meeting him. He wore the standard gray uniform of a junior conclave delegate, which had a small coffee stain near the left cuff that he had not been able to remove. He had a notebook open on his knee and a nutrition bar half-eaten in his left hand, and he had been taking careful notes since the ceremony began because Director Pelham, who was supposed to be here instead of him, had come down with a lung infection 2 days ago. Roan had been told to observe, document everything, and stay quiet. He was doing exactly that. Up at the front, High Chancellor Dravak stood at the ceremonial podium. Dravak was an amphibian elder from the Quorith system, 300 years old, with wide golden eyes and a voice like stone rolling downhill. He had been certain, for the past several decades, that this bonding ceremony would choose him. He had prepared a speech. He had practiced the expression he would wear when the dragon approached. He had even commissioned a quiet portrait of himself seated on the golden throne. The celestial hatchling, Dravak announced to the chamber, emerges once every 100 years. It does not choose by vote. It does not choose by rank. The bond is sacred and absolute. Whatever the dragon chooses, the conclave accepts. He said those last words as a formality. He did not believe they would be tested. The chamber doors at the far end opened. The dragon came in slowly. It was small, smaller than most people expected for something that would one day be the size of a warship. Its scales were silver blue, lit from within by a soft gold light that pulsed gently with each step. Its eyes were the color of deep space where stars are just beginning to form. It moved with the careful, deliberate pace of something that understood it was being watched and did not care, even slightly. The crowd went absolutely still. The dragon walked the ceremonial path, a long aisle of white stone that ran from the entrance doors all the way to the front of the chamber, where the golden throne waited on a raised platform. The throne was ancient, carved from a material that no longer existed in the known galaxy, and it glowed faintly in the presence of the dragon, the way it always had during past ceremonies. Delegates leaned forward as the hatchling passed their rows. Generals straightened. Dravak composed his expression into something he hoped looked dignified and open. The dragon reached the throne. It looked at the throne for a long moment. It sniffed the armrest. It tilted its small, luminous head. Then it sat down on the throne, and the chamber erupted in noise, cheers and calls of celebration from every tier, and Dravak began to step forward, certain this was his moment. And then the dragon stood back up. It stepped down from the throne. It walked away from it. It turned its back on the golden throne of the Galactic Conclave and stood in the aisle with a look of complete calm. The cheering stopped so fast it was like a sound being cut with a blade. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. In 300 years of recorded bonding ceremonies, a dragon had never refused the throne. The records said it was impossible. The records were apparently wrong. The hatchling turned. Its glowing eyes swept across the front rows, past the generals, past the ambassadors, past Chancellor Dravak, who was still standing half-raised from his seat, with his mouth slightly open. The dragon's gaze moved further back, past the middle tiers, past the secondary delegates, further and further, until it reached the very last row, until it found Roan Aldrich. Roan, who had been writing the words "Dragon sat on throne" in his notebook, felt something and looked up. He found himself staring into eyes that seemed to contain entire star systems. He also became aware, very slowly, that every single living being in the grand chamber had turned to look at him. He still had half a nutrition bar in his hand. "Oh," he said quietly, to no one in particular. The dragon took one step toward the last row, then another, its golden light filling the silent chamber. It did not look away from Roan. Not once. As if it had known exactly where to look from the moment it opened its eyes, and had simply been walking in that direction all along. There is a specific kind of panic that does not look like panic. It looks like very calm, very fast walking, and it filled the grand chamber the moment the ceremony ended. Roan was surrounded within 30 seconds. Not by admirers. By officials. They wore the gold-trimmed coats of the Conclave Administrative Corps, and they moved around him in a tight ring, speaking to each other in rapid tones and completely ignoring him, as if he were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. The dragon walked alongside him, unhurried, its shoulder level with Roan's elbow, its golden light making the officials flinch slightly every time it got too close. Nobody had touched Roan. Nobody had asked him a single question. They just moved, and apparently he was expected to move with them. He went. He was still holding his notebook. Behind him, in the main chamber, the noise had become enormous. Roan could hear Dravak's voice above the rest, high and sharp, the voice of a person who had been practicing patience for 300 years and had just run completely out of it. The creature is confused, Dravak was saying, loudly enough for the recording systems to capture. There is clearly some kind of disruption to the bonding signal. We need a full examination before any conclusions are drawn. Several voices agreed immediately. Several others were quieter. One voice said, very calmly, "Chancellor, the law does not provide for examinations. The law provides for acceptance." That was Ambassador Scylla, representing the Corn people. She was small by galactic standards, with pale green skin and the composed manner of someone who had sat through a great many arguments and found most of them unpersuasive. She fell into step beside Roan as he was walked down the administrative corridor, which surprised the officials considerably. "How are you feeling?" she asked him, as if they were acquainted, which they were not. "I'm not sure," Roan said honestly. "What exactly just happened?" "The dragon chose you," Silas said. "I understood that part. I meant, what does that mean? Legally, procedurally. What happens now?" She looked at him with something like surprised interest. "You are asking procedural questions." "I was sent here to document the ceremony," Roan said. "I would like to document what comes next as well." The officials brought him to a suite of rooms in the sovereign wing of the cradle, a section of the station that had not been occupied in the 60 years since the last sovereign rider passed away. The rooms were enormous and very clean, and had the faintly sad quality of places that have been maintained but not lived in. The furniture was made for a species significantly larger than a human, which meant that when Roan sat in the nearest chair, his feet did not quite touch the floor. The dragon jumped up and sat beside him, folding its wings with a sound like a flag settling. The officials left to file urgent reports. Silas stayed. "The last time a dragon refused the throne," she told him, standing near the window that looked out over stars, "was 900 years ago. The hatchling refused and then chose a physician from a border colony. No rank, no military record, no political connections." She paused. "She served for 40 years. Historians consider her one of the 3 most effective sovereign riders in Conclave history." "What did she do that was effective?" Roan asked. "She kept records. She noticed things. She asked questions that made powerful people uncomfortable." Scylla looked at him. She was very easy to underestimate. Roan wrote something in his notebook. Outside the window, the news had already reached the wider galaxy. He did not know this yet, but back on Earth, every information feed had stopped running its regular content. People were watching the footage from the Grand Chamber, a silver-blue dragon, lit with gold, walking the full length of a chamber containing the most powerful beings in the known universe, and stopping at a human in a gray uniform with a coffee stain on his cuff. The feeds were running it on a loop. In the chamber, Dravak had composed himself enough to speak to his legal team. He wanted a formal challenge filed. He wanted precedents pulled. He wanted to know every possible avenue by which a bonding could be declared invalid, questioned, delayed, or reviewed. His senior legal advisor, an ancient creature who had served 3 conclave chancellors, told him very quietly that there were no such avenues. The bond was absolute. The law was clear. It had been made clear specifically because, in the past, powerful people had tried to contest it, and the resulting instability had damaged the conclave for generations. "Then we find another way," Dravak said. Back in the sovereign wing, Roan had fallen asleep in the too large chair, his notebook still open on his lap, his pen still in his hand. The dragon lay against his side, watching the door with calm, unblinking eyes. A young aide who had been assigned to bring Roan a meal stopped in the doorway, looked at the scene, and very quietly set the tray on the nearest table and left without making a sound. He sent a message to his supervisor that simply read, "The human is asleep. The dragon is awake. I think things are going to be different now." His supervisor did not reply for a long time. When she did, she wrote, "Yes, I think so too." Roan woke up at some hour he could not name, in a room that was too large and too quiet, with a dragon pressed warm against his ribs. He did not go back to sleep. Instead, he got up carefully, moved to the wide desk near the window, and opened his notebook to a clean page. Then he pulled up the public conclave archive on the room's terminal and started reading. He did not know exactly what he was looking for. He started with bonding ceremony records and went backwards, oldest first. He read for 6 hours. By the time the station's artificial light had shifted from night cycle to day cycle, he had filled 11 pages of notes and found something he had not expected. Every controversial bonding in recorded history, the ones where the dragon had chosen someone unusual, someone outside the expected hierarchy, had followed a pattern. Not in who was chosen, in what happened after. The physician chosen 900 years ago, a grain farmer from a world with no strategic value, chosen 400 years ago, a refugee with no citizenship in any recognized system, chosen 200 years ago. Every one of them had been laughed at, questioned, and eventually left alone, because every one of them had done something simple and powerful. They had paid attention. They had noticed things. They had treated the conclave's oldest problems as things that could actually be solved, rather than managed, and they had been right. Roan wrote the word pattern and underlined it twice. A knock came at the door. He opened it to find Scholar Adine, the conclave's chief archivist, a being of indeterminate age with 4 arms, pale skin the color of old paper, and the careful eyes of someone who had spent centuries surrounded by information. Adine carried a stack of physical documents, which was unusual enough in the current era that it meant something. "You requested access to the restricted bonding archives," Adine said. "I did," Roan confirmed. "Last night. I wasn't sure anyone would approve it." "No one has ever requested them before," Adine said. The approval was automatic. A pause. "May I come in?" They sat at the large desk together, the dragon watching from the corner with its head on its folded arms. Adine laid out the restricted documents one at a time, and they went through them together. And as the hours passed, Adine began to talk. Not in the formal way of an official, but in the way of a person who has known something for a long time and never been asked about it. "The dragons do not choose based on power," Adine said. "Every record suggests the same thing, if you read carefully. They choose based on resonance." A word from the old language. The nearest translation is the ability to carry a heavy thing without changing its shape under the weight. Roan thought about that. Without becoming something else because of the pressure. "Yes," Adine said, and looked at him with the particular attention of someone revising an opinion upward. "Exactly that." That afternoon, Roan walked the sovereign wing with his notebook and found 3 things that did not belong together. A resource allocation report from 6 years ago. A treaty amendment ratified quietly during a major summit when everyone was distracted. A standing order from the conclave's infrastructure division that had never been publicly announced. Taken separately, each one was unremarkable. Together, they described a situation in which one outer rim species had been quietly denied access to a mineral deposit that, by 3 separate agreements, they had legal rights to. It had been going on for 11 years. Roan wrote it all down and added a note at the bottom. Find out who benefits. He did not know yet that the answer would lead directly to Dravak. The dragon, meanwhile, was growing. Not enormously, not visibly by the hour, but the aides who brought meals and checked on the sovereign wing were certain. The hatchling was larger than it had been the day before, and larger still the day after that. The station's medical officer pulled the bonding records and confirmed it. Growth rate among celestial hatchlings was directly tied to bond strength. A strong bond meant fast growth. An exceptional bond meant growth that did not follow the expected charts at all. Soren, Roan had called the dragon that, quietly, on the second night, without ceremony, was not following the expected charts. General Sarah Valen appeared at the door of the Sovereign Wing on the third day. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that had decided things and lived with them. She had been at the front row during the ceremony. She had medals on her uniform that represented conflicts Roan had only read about in history files. She did not speak at first. She watched Roan at the desk for a long moment, watched the dragon watching Roan, and then said, "What are you doing?" "Reading the infrastructure reports for the last 15 years, Roan said, without looking up. A silence. "Why?" "Because nobody else has," he said. Sarah stood there a moment longer. Then she walked in, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from him. "Show me," she said. He showed her. She did not say anything for a long time after he finished. Then she said, very quietly, "I knew something was wrong in that sector. I could not find what." "It was in the footnotes," Roan said. 3 different documents. You'd have to read all 3 to see it." Sarah looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. "And you read all 3. "I read everything," he said. "That's what I do." Outside the Sovereign Wing, the legal challenge from Dravak's coalition had been formally filed. Roan's name appeared on the official notice that evening. He read it carefully, marked 3 things, and made a note. He was beginning to understand what he had been chosen for. He was not certain he was ready, but he was going to read every document there was before he walked into that hall, and that, at least, he knew how to do. The Hall of Law inside the cradle was designed to be intimidating. The walls were black stone veined with silver. The seating rose in steep tiers on 3 sides, and the floor in the center was open and bare, so that whoever stood there stood alone, surrounded on all sides by watching eyes. Every session was broadcast. At any given moment, several billion people across the galaxy were watching. Dravak's coalition had brought 11 legal representatives. They arranged themselves at a long table with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times. Their documents were organized. Their arguments were rehearsed. They had spent a week preparing. Roan walked in with 3 sheets of paper and a pen. He sat at the single chair on the opposite side of the floor, and Soren, noticeably larger than he had been just days ago, his gold lights steadier and stronger, folded his wings, and High Arbiter Naum presided from the elevated bench at the front. Naum was the oldest active judicial officer in the conclave, old enough to remember 3 sovereign riders, old enough to have seen most forms of argument and been moved by very few of them. Naum looked down at Roan over the bench with an expression that revealed nothing. "The challenge is filed by Chancellor Dravak and 6 co-signatory species," Naum said. "The grounds are procedural irregularity, species qualification, and credential insufficiency. Challenging party will present first." The lead legal representative for the coalition stood. He was a large being from the Thresh system, known for producing excellent advocates, and he was excellent. He spoke for 40 minutes. He cited 14 precedents. He used charts. He referenced 3 conclave founding documents and 2 subsequent amendments. His argument was layered and careful and built toward a clean conclusion, that the bonding ceremony had never been designed to accommodate a junior species delegate with no standing, no record, and no qualifications relevant to governing a galactic body. It was a good argument. When it was finished, Naum looked at Roan. Response. Roan stood. He picked up his 3 sheets of paper. "I'd like to start with the first precedent cited," he said. "The Dara Commission ruling of 440 years ago. The coalition used it to argue that bonding selections can be reviewed when the chosen individual lacks institutional standing." He looked at his paper. The full ruling actually says the opposite. The section they cited is from the dissenting opinion. The majority opinion, 3 pages later, affirms that the dragon's selection is final and that institutional standing is not a qualifying criterion. I have the full document if the arbiter would like to review it. He set the first sheet on the table. It had the full citation written on it. A silence. "Second precedent," Roan said, and continued. He went through all 14. He did not raise his voice. He did not use charts. He spoke at a pace that was easy to follow, and he thanked each legal representative by name when he addressed a point they had made. And he was so relentlessly polite about dismantling their arguments that it took several minutes for the watching gallery to understand that that was what he was doing. 3 of the 14 precedents had been cited in ways that cut against the coalition's own position. Two others had been superseded by laws that Dravak's coalition members had personally signed into existence. Roan noted this without emphasis, as if it were simply an interesting fact, which somehow made it worse. By the time he reached the ninth precedent, the legal team's lead representative had stopped taking notes and was staring. Dravak could not contain himself. He rose from his seat in the gallery without being recognized and said, loudly, "This human has no experience, no background, and no understanding of what it means to govern a civilization, let alone 300 of them." The hall went very quiet. Roan turned toward Dravak's direction. He waited a moment, long enough to let the silence settle. "I understand you're afraid," he said. "So am I. But that is not a legal argument, Chancellor." He turned back to Nahum. "My final point concerns the credential insufficiency claim. The coalition argues that I have no relevant credentials. The Conclave's own founding charter defines credential sufficiency for a sovereign rider in Article 1, Section 3. The only credential listed is the Dragon's Choice. There is no secondary list. There are no supplemental requirements. The founders wrote it that way deliberately because they understood that the Dragon does not make procedural errors." He set his last sheet of paper on the table. "I don't have anything else to add," he said, and sat down. Soren breathed out once. A single breath of slow golden light that moved through the air of the hall like something alive, and then faded. Every being in the room felt it. Nobody quite had words for it. Nahum sat still for a long moment. "The challenge is dismissed," Nahum said. "On all grounds. The bonding is valid. Roan Aldrich is the sovereign rider of the Galactic Conclave. This ruling is final and is not subject to further challenge." The gallery erupted. Not all of it in celebration. There was plenty of furious noise from Dravak's section, but the overall sound was something large and shifting, the sound of a narrative changing direction. General Sara came down from the gallery and crossed the floor, which no one was technically supposed to do, and stood beside Roan. He was putting the cap back on his pen. "You have no idea what you just inherited," she said. Roan looked at his notes. He thought about the resource allocation report, the treaty amendment, the 11 years. The footnotes in 3 separate documents that no one had read. "I have some idea," he said. "I've been reading." The scope of the sovereign rider's role was explained to Roan on a Tuesday by a senior administrator named Bull who had worked in the Conclave's executive office for 40 years and had the manner of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times it no longer surprised him. 312 species, 17 active territorial disputes, 41 standing treaties requiring annual review. A resource arbitration backlog that stretched back 9 years. A communications infrastructure that served 40 billion people and had not been meaningfully upgraded in 2 decades. An outer rim policy framework that everyone agreed was broken and no one had been willing to fix. The last sovereign rider, Bull said, with care, managed these issues. "What does managed mean?" Roan asked. Bull paused. "Kept them from escalating. So not solving them, just containing them." Another pause. "Yes." Roan wrote something in his notebook. "All right, let's start with the resource arbitration backlog. Can you get me everything filed in the last 9 years, sorted by originating species and disputed territory?" Bull stared at him. "That is over 4,000 cases. I'm not going to read all of them today," Roan said reasonably. "But I need to understand what we're dealing with before I can figure out where to start." The files arrived by end of day. Roan read until he fell asleep and continued the next morning. He built a team the way he had always built things, slowly and by asking questions. He did not announce that he was building a team. He simply noticed which people in the Conclave's various divisions gave him accurate information when he asked for it, and which ones gave him the information they thought he wanted to hear, and he kept talking to the first kind and stopped talking to the second kind. Within 2 weeks, he had 6 people he trusted, from 5 different species, none of whom had expected to be anywhere near the sovereign's office. Ambassador Sila became his primary diplomatic contact, because she told him things he did not want to hear without making it dramatic about it. General Sara, who had appointed herself his chief of security without anyone formally asking her to, began attending his morning briefings and asking sharp questions about the territorial disputes. Adine the archivist sent him documents unprompted, always with a small note that said things like page 34, third paragraph, with no further explanation, and Roan learned to go directly to page 34, third paragraph. because Adine was never wrong. The Outer Rim resource conflict, the one Roan had found in the footnotes on his third night, took 3 months to untangle. It was not fast. It required 11 separate meetings with the affected species and 4 formal hearings, and one extremely tense session where 2 delegations refused to be in the same room, and Roan spent 4 hours going back and forth between them like a person delivering messages across a very large, very angry house. But at the end of it, the mineral rights were formally restored. 11 years of quiet theft was officially acknowledged in the conclave record. 2 species who had regarded each other with cold suspicion for over a decade agreed, in writing, to a joint development arrangement. What Dravak did next was worse. He obtained, through channels Roan could not yet trace, an internal document. One of Roan's early memos, written in his first week, when he had been trying to understand the scope of the role and had written frankly about how much he did not know. Dravak leaked it. It appeared on every major information network with commentary suggesting that the sovereign writer was overwhelmed, unqualified, and privately aware of his own inadequacy. The problem was that the memo also showed, in the same document, that Roan had already identified the resource rights violation and begun documenting it. The leak meant to embarrass him ended up publishing his work. Species in 40-star systems read the memo and saw a sovereign writer who acknowledged uncertainty, did the research, found the problem, and fixed it. The response was not what Dravak had planned. Meanwhile, Soren was no longer small. He was not yet the size of a warship. That would take years, but he was large enough now that he could not walk the corridor of the sovereign wing without his wings touching both walls if he opened them, and when he stood beside Roan at a window, his head was level with the ceiling. The station's medical officer updated the growth chart every week, and every week shook her head at it. One evening Roan sat at the window with Soren and wrote a message to Earth. Not to the government, not to a news service. Just a message, addressed to his sister, who taught secondary school in a city he had not visited in over a year. He wrote about what the work was like, about how much he did not know and how much he was learning, about the resource conflict and the 11 meetings and the way the 2 delegations had eventually, reluctantly, shaken hands. He wrote, "I don't know if I'm doing this right, but I'm trying to do it honestly. Tell the kids I said hello." His sister posted it publicly without asking him. She did not think it would go anywhere. Within 6 hours, it had been translated into 247 languages and transmitted to 40-star systems, mostly by a junior communications officer who saw it in a shared database and assumed it was meant to be distributed. Silas sent Roan a message that night. It said, "You have received official responses from 39 species. Most of them say variations of the same thing. They say, finally, someone who sounds like a real person." Roan read the message. He thought about that for a while. Then he wrote back, "That's either very good or very alarming." Sila replied, "In my experience, it is always both." At the edge of the galaxy, in a region called the Fold, something very old had begun to wake up. Nobody knew yet, but Soren raised his head that night and looked toward the outer dark for a long time before he closed his eyes again, and Roan noticed and wrote a single word in his notebook. What? He underlined it. He would find out. The report came in on a quiet morning, marked low priority by the sensor team because nobody had checked the Fold in 11 years, and the system that flagged anomalies there was running on software so old it classified almost everything as background noise. It was Adine who caught it, reading the raw data files the way Adine read everything, completely and without skipping. The archivist sent it to Roan with a note that said only, page 1. All of it. Roan read it. Then he went to find General Sara. The Fold was a region at the outer edge of the mapped galaxy, 11 days from the cradle at standard travel. For most of recorded history, it had been empty. But the sensor report showed mass, an enormous amount of it, moving in formation, coming from deep inside the Fold at a slow and deliberate pace. Ships, the report estimated. Hundreds of them. Possibly more, the farther reaches not yet visible. The Conclave's military command wanted to intercept. They had that conversation in the main briefing room, with maps spread across the table and strategy officers speaking over one another. The proposal was a defensive fleet, standard protocol for an unidentified mass approaching from outside mapped space, ready to engage if the formation did not respond to communication attempts. The formation did not respond to communication attempts. For days of signals on every known frequency produced nothing. Then we treat it as hostile, one of the strategy officers said. Or, Roan said, from his seat at the end of the table, we find out why it isn't answering. He had been reading for 2 days straight. Not the military reports. The historical archive, specifically, a section that almost nobody had ever accessed, because it concerned a civilization that had been gone for 10,000 years. The Avan, a species that had once stretched across 30 star systems before a slow collapse that the histories called political, but which Roan, reading carefully, understood was something more specific. A sovereign rider had broken the bond. Not by dying, by choosing. By abandoning the bond in exchange for a political arrangement that gave him more individual power. The dragon had left. Without the dragon, the Avan's governing structure lost its center. The collapse had taken a generation. Before the end, the Avan had built something. An armada, fully automated, programmed with a single objective. Find a sovereign bearing a true bond. Protect them. Wait. 10,000 years. It had been waiting for 10,000 years. It isn't attacking, Roan said. It's looking. The room was not convinced. They argued for another hour. In the end, Roan did not order them to stand down. He asked them to wait, to hold the defensive fleet at the edge of the fold, and he asked for a single fast ship. Sara told him she was coming. He did not argue with her. Roan had ridden Soren before, in the station's lower bays, short distances, getting used to the weight and warmth of it, the way the bond felt like a conversation without words. But he had never ridden Soren in open space. Nobody had. Soren was large enough now, and the bond was strong enough, and when Roan asked, not with words, but with the simple clear intention that a dean would have called resonance, Soren answered with emotion that meant yes, and something that meant obviously, and maybe something else that felt like at last. They went in through the outer edge of the fold, Sara's ship running parallel at a safe distance, every sensor in the conclave trained on them. The armada was visible now, vast, old, built from a material that did not match anything in current catalogs. The ships were dark, no running lights, no heat signatures beyond the baseline. They moved like they had all the time in existence, which they did. Roan opened the communication channel. He did not broadcast a frequency or a code or a military signal. He read aloud from the archive record, the Avan's own words, translated and translated again over 10,000 years, but still carrying the shape of what they had originally meant. He read the record of the bond they had honored. He read the record of the bond that had been broken. He said the names of their sovereign riders, all of them, in order, the way a person would name members of a family. He said, your people are remembered. What you built is not forgotten. You can rest. Soren had been still through all of it. Now he breathed out, a long, slow breath, and the light that came with it was different from the usual gold. It was deeper. It moved through the vacuum of space the way light should not be able to move, and touched the nearest ship in the armada, and held there. The armada stopped. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, one ship at a time, from the front to the back, the armada's systems went dark. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Powered down. A choice. The formation began to drift, no longer moving on any programmed course, and the silence of 10,000 years of waiting settled into something that felt, even on sensors and through screens and across 11 days of space, like peace. Back at the cradle, the feeds had been running live. Every species with a broadcast system had been watching. The general who had wanted to fire first stood at the monitor room window and said nothing for a long time. Dravak, watching alone from a private room, turned off his screen. When Roan returned, there was no ceremony. He landed in the lower bay, walked up the corridor, went to the sovereign wing, and sat at his desk. Soren settled on the floor beside him, eyes half closed, huge and warm and present. A young aide knocked and asked, with genuine confusion in his voice, "How did you know that would work, Sovereign?" Roan thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything. "I didn't," he said, "but it was the honest thing to try." The aide nodded slowly and left. Roan opened his notebook. There was a new case in the arbitration files, something about water rights on a Moon 3 systems over. He found the page, uncapped his pen, and started reading. Somewhere in the archived footage of the bonding ceremony, which now had more views than any broadcast in galactic history, A researcher would later notice a detail that no one had caught in the immediate chaos of that day. The dragon had not looked at the golden throne first. Frame by frame, enhanced and slowed, the footage showed Soren's eyes moving across the chamber before he ever reached the throne, moving past the generals and the chancellors and the ambassadors, finding the last row, finding Roan. The dragon had known exactly where to go from the moment it opened its eyes. The walk to the throne had been a formality, a courtesy to the ceremony. The choice had already been made.